think a huge amount of companies that end up failing because the founders just decide like, hey, this is probably not worth it. Like, this is just too hard.
Welcome back to 40-Minute Mentor, the podcast on a mission to raise aspirations and inspire the next generation of category-defining founders, all in just 40 minutes. Today, I'm joined by Vegard Medbø, co-founder and COO of Antler, the global early-stage fund helping entrepreneurs go from 0 to 1. Prior to Antler, Vegard served 2 years in the Coastal Ranger Command of the Norwegian Armed Forces and spent nearly 6 years at McKinsey, working with the world's top energy companies, helping them apply machine learning in renewable and non-renewable energy. Since founding Antler, the team have invested in over 1,000 companies, addressing meaningful challenges and opportunities across 6 continents. Their portfolio, valued at $4.8 billion, represents 145 nationalities, and 32% of their portfolio has at least one female founder. I can't wait to learn more about the origin story of Antler, how they've grown on such a global scale, and Vegard's thoughts on the future of VC. So all that's left to say is a big warm welcome to Vegard. Welcome to 40-Minute Mentor. How are you?
Thanks, James. I'm good. Excited to be here.
We are very excited to have you here. Thank you so much. Well, we always like to get our listeners to get to know you a little bit, warm you up as well with some quickfire questions. So please finish the following sentences after me. Number 1, the best career decision I've ever made was?
Probably to join and then later leave McKinsey. It's a great starting point in a career.
Yes, we will come on to McKinsey because a few podcast guests have been there and it seems to be a great environment for future entrepreneurs and investors. So thank you. The hardest lesson I've learnt as a VC is?
It's probably just how hard it is both for founders and investors to know whether a company, an idea will be successful. Even the best companies, even the companies that we know today that are super successful today, and it all kind of looks super easy, had probably hundreds of investors who said no, and customers who said no, and employees who said no to join them. So it's kind of the how hard the journey is for founders is probably the hardest lesson.
Yeah, that's so true. One misconception about VC I'd love to correct is?
That at this super early stage that investors invest in companies. I think in reality, investors at the pre-seed, or as we call it, inception stage, they invest in founders. And often founders think they are pitching their company, but in reality, the founders are actually just pitching themselves.
Yes, yeah, it's so true. Well, we're looking forward to coming on to talking about what it is you look for in those founders. And finally, the biggest shift I see coming in VC is?
I think over time, as more and more traditional investors invest at the later stage of companies, there'll be a lot more people investing in sort of trying to find ways to back people before they start a company or in the very sort of inception stage of a company. I think that's it's the kind of trickiest phase, but it's also the most interesting one.
Okay, fantastic. Well, thank you for sharing those thoughts, Vegard. We're going to dive into all things Antler soon, but before we do that, we'll talk a little bit about your earlier career, because I know you worked for the Norwegian Armed Forces in the earlier parts of your career, which is a really interesting starting point. So what led you into the Armed Forces, and what were some of the transferable skills that you picked up there that have helped you in your subsequent career?
Yeah, so in Norway, we actually have a mandatory military service. So the first thing that limit there was that I had to. Every young kid, 17 or 18 years old, needs to serve a year. Now, what I thought like, hey, this is not going to be that useful. I'll stick around for the 1 year and then I'll move on. And I actually ended up kind of after that 1 year joining as a professional operator because I loved it. And I realized I was good at it. I loved it. It was great people, but the initial thing that led me there was that I had to, but I thought, now this is going to be a year that otherwise I'd rather make it the most interesting that I can. So I applied to one unit where that entire year is basically just one single selection, where I think we started out being 160 people or so. We ended up being 8 people at the end, where they basically just put us through a lot of kind of tests and stuff to basically just try to get, I think in the end, they try to get people to quit. And what you then get at the end is that you get the few percent of people who are just never going to quit. And that means which is probably the most important thing to select for in a military unit, because if you need people to be very self-sufficient, very reliable, one of the biggest kind of failure modes in a high risk or high complexity situation is that people might give up. So that first year was basically about not quitting, regardless what they put you through, and then all of the 8 of us ended up actually then joining that unit as a professional, and I stayed on for another year.
Amazing. And what were the kind of the biggest lessons or transferable skills you took from that? I guess one probably being resilience and that kind of drive to not give up, which has no doubt helped in your sort of entrepreneurial and investing career since.
Yeah, I think resilience is definitely one. And I don't think you actually learn resilience. I think that's something that sits in each person probably when they're born, but you learn about it. Like you
Mm.
see how far you can push yourself. And that's a really useful learning. And I think second is you learn the value of kind of teamwork. Like so after that first year of selection, we ended up operating in sort of very small units of 5 or 6 people and in a very independent way. So I kind of learned the value of having a team that you can 100% rely on, and then like in the extreme scenario, you need to rely on them with your life, and they need to rely on you with their life. And the amount of training and sort of preparation that we did, which kind of got us to the place where we had that mutual reliance, was really useful. And I think actually quite transferable to building a company or to working in a team or to being any part of the sort of normal non-military world.
So, Vegard, you then spent 6 years at McKinsey, which you mentioned at the beginning of this chat, where you worked with some of the leading energy companies in the world. And obviously, it's a hugely prestigious place to work. So, how did you find your time there? And what were some of the biggest sort of takeaways from that period of your career?
I think places like McKinsey and places like McKinsey, whether it's in a good consulting company or whether it's a law firm or investment bank, like there's a couple of these places where people start where I think the biggest thing they do is it's a really good starting point in a career because it helps you set almost like the bar for the kind of people and the kind of ambition you expect from yourself and others. Like you work with, when I was there, you work more or less, you surround yourself with really ambitious, really smart, really hardworking people. Everyone's super ambitious. And I think that kind of, it more or less sets that bar for you. And I think that sticks with you for a very long time, maybe throughout your entire career. That's probably the most important thing. Like what we worked on, we worked with a variety of companies. The main thing these kind of different projects had in common is probably you have a very short time. You need to do a lot of stuff in a very short time. It's typically in an industry or context or with a company that you don't know that well. So you need to figure out a huge amount of stuff in a very short time. And I think that's very transferable to to a lot of things you do later in life. It basically helps you learn fast and it helps you move really fast. And whether the next thing you do is start a company or join a team or do anything else where you need to be fast moving, it kind of sets you on the path to be successful at it. I think that's the most important, to be honest, and that I took away from McKinsey.
Oh, awesome. And I guess coming on to Antler then, can you share a bit about the origin story for anyone that hasn't heard of the business? Can you share a bit more about your broader investment thesis?
Yeah. So the origin story, at least for me, it kind of has a tiny link to the military because Antler CEO is a guy called Magnus, who I worked with in McKinsey, but actually got initially introduced through this military connection because although he's a couple of years older than me, he was in a sister unit of mine in the military and his brother was in my unit. So when I was in university, we got connected through his brother. He was part of convincing me to join McKinsey in the first place. We worked together there for a couple of years. Magnus worked a lot in Asia, and he actually ended up leaving McKinsey in 2013 or 14 to build a company in Asia called Zalora. And the observations that led to us starting Antler that Magnus shared with me in a catch-up we had in late 2017 was basically a couple of observations around ex-Zalora founders. So Zalora was ended up becoming a pretty big company, and they were really good at hiring really ambitious people. And so one observation was basically that when you work with someone, you're seeing them execute, you're seeing their speed of execution, the speed of learning, how good people they can hire, how ambitious they are, if you've seen them over a period of time, even in just a couple of months, and they then go on and start a company, you have a pretty strong idea on whether that person could be a successful founder. And the other observation was a lot of these founders spend a lot of time kind of figuring out stuff in a very early stage of a company where they need to bounce off ideas with others. And some of the ones that were the most successful were the ones who spent the most time kind of getting input from others, pulling on the network, talking to other people who have founded either similar companies or companies in the same region. So the kind of network sets the best founders apart. So I thought, hey, there's an opportunity here, which basically is what became Antler, which is let's try to bring people together who are at that kind of super, super early stage, typically before they founded a company, where they're at the cusp of starting something. They might have one idea that they've been thinking about for a while, or they might have 5 ideas and they want to narrow that down to the one that they have the most conviction in. And they want to do that in a community and an environment of people where there's more than themselves. There's, let's say, 50 other people who are working also super hard on their own ideas, where they can bounce ideas, where they can test out their thinking, they can get critical feedback, and at the same time creates a bit of a competitive pressure where everyone is kind of roughly at the same stage and everyone is sort of positively competing to move fast, to get the first product out, to get the first customer on, get the first investor on. And where we both can help founders through that process, but also in return basically get to see them execute and get to build conviction on the individuals who build that company. So that's what we started in 2018, where we basically tried to bring founders together, work with them, kind of enable them to work with one another fully in person, full time, all in, for a period of 3 to 6 months, where we typically end up becoming the first investor into the companies that get started.
Antler is a hugely successful company. So I'd love just for our listeners to get a sense of that by hearing a bit about some of the most successful bits of the experience and maybe some of the most high profile companies that have come through Antler.
Yeah, so we've invested in more than 1,000 companies to date over the last 7 years. And that's out of, I think, we've had probably 400,000 people apply to join Antler. We've invested in around 1,000 companies. Most of these companies are still fairly young. I think the average age of our companies is around 2 years old. Probably the most well-known company, at least in the consumer space, that we backed is a company called Eralo, which is the biggest eSIM marketplace globally, founded in 2019. We backed Bahadir, who's the founder of the company, in our second residency back in Singapore in 2019. And he'd been basically selling SIM cards his entire life in kind of a variety of different ways in a variety of different companies. And he was now he felt this is the time that you can actually build a company that can be global, basically selling eSIMs to travelers. Like at the time, I was traveling a lot. I had a bag of SIM cards in my travel bag, and it solved a massive problem for me. So Aralo, you can basically open the app, download any SIM card. I'm using it more or less every day, and I can travel to more or less every company in the sort of country in the world.
That's amazing. That's so cool. Thank you for sharing. I've seen some of the amazing talent and companies that have come through Antler over the last few years, and you've expanded to multiple countries since, you've grown the team, and obviously the portfolio and the value of that is so significant. So I guess with all the good stuff, let's look back to the beginning. What were those early days of building it out, like proving the concept, getting buy-in from founders? What was that like, and how does that compare now to the relatively big beast you've created and the impact you've had? I'd love to hear your reflections on those two things and those two phases.
Yeah, I think in the very early days we had a rough idea of what we were trying to do, but we had really no idea how to invest, how to raise money, how to identify the right founders, how to convince them to join us. I think the very first residency, July 2018, I think we were all in the office the day before, and we were not even sure if anyone would show up. Like we had convinced a lot of people. We'd spoken to hundreds of founders. We had convinced a few of them to join us. I think we had 62 people who were joining us on the first day, and we were not fully sure whether they would actually show up. Now, it turns out everyone actually showed up, and we spent 3 months working with them and invested in 30 companies coming out of that their first residency. Those companies were quickly getting to revenues, getting good investors on board. So like it all kind of worked out. But I think the most important distinction from then to today is that we literally made everything up kind of roughly the day before, because we didn't have the time to kind of plan like, hey, how should this look over a 6 months time frame, to plan more or less a day at a time. Ran into things that we didn't know how we would do, figured out kind of first version and solved it, and kind of took the next day. But a lot of the things that we did early in that first residency is kind of parts of what we do today. Like I think we set a standard of like, hey, let's have a super high intensity in the first couple of weeks. It's like the intensity you set at something at the beginning really sticks with, that tends to stick in whatever you're doing. So we said, hey, let's do the first 2 weeks, there's no weekends. So we ran the first 2 weeks all in every single day to set a really high pace. And we don't do that in every residency today, but we do try to set a really high pace in the beginning so that the founders kind of expect from themselves and one another that everyone will move fast, everyone is there. This is only going to work if we all work super, super hard. That is one example of a thing that kind of has persisted from the very first residency till today.
Yeah, and you run lots of great initiatives, including your residency and academy program. So do you mind sharing with our audience a bit more about the different options founders have when they get involved with Antler? And second to that, I'm sure our audience will be very interested in what the perfect founder profile is for Antler. So yeah, those two questions, please.
Yeah, we believe that the most important thing for a founder who's just starting out is kind of speed, focus, and intensity. Moving fast is probably the biggest differentiator between the teams that kind of make it and the teams that don't. And what we've seen is like helping people move fast is all about kind of creating an environment to push, where you can both kind of positively push people and where they can positively push themselves, and at the same time where you can sort of quickly remove obstacles. Obstacles could be like, hey, I don't know, like I'm building a product, but I don't know how to reach a person at this company that I need to figure out some part of my product, or I need to test this out with these kinds of users, or I've just not built on this kind of stack before. What the Antler residency does is to bring together a group of people that are highly selected. We end up typically selecting around 2 to 3% of the ones who apply. Most of them are second-time founders. Most of them have either built a company before or been in a super fast-growing company before, kind of solving something important in that company. So then you're kind of surrounded by, and they're all at the stage of inception of a company. So they're all there to build. They have a huge variety of experiences and a huge variety of networks. And what that creates is kind of this bit of a pressure cooker where everyone is in some way creating a bit of a positive competitive pressure, where if someone launches the first product, people will notice. If someone gets the first customer, people will notice, and it kind of pushes everyone to move fast. And at the same time, they can use one another to remove blockers, especially kind of bouncing ideas, getting feedback, using one of those networks, getting to whether it's the first customer, getting to hire, getting to investor, goes so much faster when you have, say, another 50 or 70 people you can actually pull on. In addition to, of course, the people in the Antler team who can also help a lot. So that's kind of the main product, is basically that there's a group of ambitious people working in person in one place on this kind of similar mission.
Perfect. And is there a perfect type of founder that you want to hear from?
I kind of believe that there's never one type of founder who will succeed. Like, we think there's a couple of things that are important. I think being on a steep trajectory, like moving fast and kind of moving fast, learning fast, showing that you're on a steep trajectory kind of in life is really important. That could be, there's a wide variety of ways that can come through, but kind of what we're looking for in founders when we interview them is we're looking for signs that they're moving fast. We're looking for things they've done previously. It could be that they were doing some really impressive sports when they were younger, and then had impressive things they did during their education. They might have started a company early in their kind of in their teens. They might have been part of a super fast growing company. We try to look for kind of momentum and a bit of a steep trajectory. And then we look for people who have something they want to solve. It's not important that we think it's a good idea, or that we think it's an idea that we are incredibly excited about. Like, what we're looking for is that the founders have conviction that this is a problem that needs solving. We'll spend time with them kind of pressure testing the idea and probably challenging them a bit on what they're building. But the most important thing is that they have something that they are convinced is a problem that needs solving.
Awesome. Thank you so much for sharing. I guess you personally have held the role of CCO and now a COO. So what does your role within Antler look like these days? What is your typical day-to-day responsibilities?
In the very beginning, I was very involved with kind of trying to figure out how do we find these founders? How do we get the word out? How do we test founders? How do we interview them? Basically, the whole kind of almost like acquisition part of Antler. The part that I spent the most of my time on is expanding Antler internationally, where we started expanding the year after we made the first investment. So in 2019, we expanded to the Nordics. A lot of us being from there, that was a kind of a natural next step. Then we launched in the UK, Netherlands, Australia, in Germany, India, US. And I've been mostly involved with kind of that process where Antlers, we chose to do things in a very decentralized way, where our organization is highly decentralized, meaning the partners that join us to build out Antler in new geography so we're all kind of working on one mission and one sort of umbrella, but each kind of region, each fund is quite independently like, how do we actually succeed in this region? Meaning the way that we identify the best founders and help them, let's say in Stockholm versus Sao Paulo, Brazil, versus Bangalore in India versus New York, is just going to be very, very different. So we decided to build Antler kind of according to that and make us highly decentralized. The partners in each fund makes a call on like, how do we find the best people? Who do we invest? How do we help them? And that kind of means that the single most important thing for us when we expanded was basically, how do we find these partners? So I spent a huge amount of time on the ground in a variety of countries, just basically talking to and interviewing people who might become someone to join us and to build that Antler in that geography. Sometimes that took meeting more than 200 people. Sometimes we were lucky and we knew someone who was based out of there and had a huge conviction on them from before. But that's been a huge part of my sort of time at Antler, is basically spending time in these markets that we were present in, meeting people and convincing people to basically join to build Antler in that geography, and then helping them in the first few months of getting it off the ground.
Awesome. You must have met some incredible people along the way. That's a great role. I guess when it comes down to it, you are helping founders get from 0 to 1, which is super exciting, but not always easy to find those winners and those people. So you mentioned earlier a little bit about what you're looking for in a founder. But I wanted to, I guess for anyone listening to this that might be thinking about Antler is a great place to sort of take their entrepreneurial journey to the next level. What for you is the difference between a good founder and a truly exceptional one that you want to invest in? And on the flip side of that, what are the qualities and behaviors that typically will put you off when you're sort of assessing talent? I think this will be hopefully really helpful for anyone listening that's kind of maybe about to start this journey.
Yeah, I think there are 3 things that you can't be successful without, and then there's a bunch of things that you probably also would want to have. But like the number one, I think, is speed of execution and speed of learning. Like every company that is just starting out, is you hit the ground running, and you're kind of running away from whether it's your kind of the runway you have as a company or the competition with other companies building in the same space. Like there's always something that, like, if you don't move fast enough, it'll catch up to you and you'll die. It's kind of running, in front of a steamroller in some ways. And a lot about starting a company is about, you're building something new. typically like the most successful companies typically end up being companies that create a market, that build something that didn't really exist before, or it kind of looked a bit ridiculous that, that thing would end up becoming or could even be a meaningful company. So it's kind of it's a hugely iterative process of like experimenting over and over and over again to figure out the thing that actually works. So speed of execution and speed of iteration is probably number one. Second is grit. Like if you find that thing that works, being a founder and building a company is kind of, if you're successful, is kind of being asked to be punched in the face every single day for 5, 10, maybe 20 years, and kind of staying the course is really, really hard. I think it's hard to know how many, but I think a huge amount of companies that end up failing sort of end up failing because the founders just decide like, hey, this is probably not worth it. Like this is just too hard. And you had Jensen of NVIDIA, I think someone asked him if you knew that NVIDIA would be as successful as it is. And it's like, it was a $3 trillion company valued, right? If you knew how successful it would be, would you do it again? And I think he did say no. I think he had some qualification around it, but like in the end, he just said like, this has been so hard, I probably wouldn't wish this on the worst enemy. So grit is a really important one. And the third one is just optimism. Like it's impossible to build a company that ends up changing the world if you're a pessimist, because like rationally, you shouldn't do this. You need to be a risk-willing, optimistic kind of person.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. I think you need to be optimistic, because why otherwise you will, it would just be so depressing. All the knockbacks, all the challenges. You've got to make sure you can get up out of bed and run at it every day and have that conviction in what you're trying to build. I think if you don't, it's just not going to be right for you. Great advice, Vegard. Thank you so much. I guess you've scaled Antler, you've seen incredible founders come through that program, and I guess have been building the business yourself and meeting incredible entrepreneurs along the way. What do you typically see makes or breaks founders as they're going through that early scaling phase? What are the areas that you find that founders struggle the most? And how do you at Antler support them through those sorts of common challenges?
There's kind of a couple of different parts of that journey where in the very beginning, you need to build something that actually touches a nerve, or like that people want to use. You need to find some problem that isn't yet solved, or that a problem that isn't solved well enough that you can solve 10 times better. So like you need the very first thing is kind of like how basically what to build. What we've seen there is when someone's been at let's say the previous company the founder was at, if they were in a role where they were kind of working, especially if that company was on the forefront of some industry and kind of pushing the needle in whatever industry they were at. And then if they were working on some of the hardest problems inside of that company, and if you then said like, hey, I've been able to solve this barely for my company, but I think there's going to be another 1,000 companies that are going to need this in the next 5 or 10 years. That's a really good place to start. But like, number one is kind of to find something that actually needs to be solved. There's a huge amount of companies that are being started, and there's probably, maybe it's a passion of the founders, but like it's not something that people want to pay money for. So number one is kind of find something that actually needs to be solved. The way we work with founders there is we help them in two ways. I think one is just challenge them, try to ask the right question, challenge them on like, is this actually something that people need and are willing to pay for? And we help them figure out like, how do you actually validate? Like, how do you test that? Who do you talk to? How do you speak to them? How do you figure out whether this is actually something that people are willing to pay money for? And then it's kind of like, if you solve that problem and there's like, hey, there's something here, you might even have a huge amount of demand. Then it's about like, how do you build your team? Like, how do you hire really good people? I think that's something that breaks a lot of companies is not getting good enough people for the kind of magnitudes of the problem you're trying to solve. And I think getting the right people, especially in the sort of founder -1 and founder -2 layers in a company, is really, really important. And because those are the people who will hire the next wave of people will be hired by them. If they're really good, then they'll hire really good people, and those will hire really good people. There's a huge kind of follow-on effect of getting the first 20 people that you bring onto your company to be really good. What we've seen, which is actually quite interesting, is a lot of people who join Antler, not everyone ends up starting a company, and a huge amount of those end up at some point, not immediately, but at some point, joining some of their kind of batchmates, let's say as a COO or as a first hire or first head of engineering. So it's a bit of a network effect that happens inside of Antler that actually benefits founders when bringing on the first kind of 1 or 2 layers of people in their company.
Great advice. Thank you, Vegard. I guess as somebody that's helped Antler scale internationally and somebody that's worked internationally, I'd love to hear your thoughts on what some of the biggest differences you're seeing across the different markets and territories, and any advice you'd have for founders who are currently looking at scaling into new geographies, because I guess it represents huge opportunities but also potential challenges. So just any learnings from your experience of this would be hugely valuable.
Yeah, I think so. My main experience is kind of building something where it's a hugely in person, almost like in your, was a physical in person environment. There are companies that can scale internationally, fully through software. The only thing you need to figure out is kind of the acquisition challenge for that country, for that geography. My main learnings is for the types of founders who actually need people on the ground in those countries, and they're like the main advice I have is like, you need to go there, you need to spend time in person. Every single place that we've expanded to is a place that I've spent, or either me or someone else, but very often me, has spent months in person, kind of talking to hundreds of people and getting to understand like the intricacies of the market, how it's different and similar to other markets, and then speaking to people to try to figure out like, hey, who are the people that we should bring on board to build Antler with us in this geography. So kind of spending time in person in the market, especially if you need to kind of build out a team, whether that is, a team like in Antler, which is an investment team, or if you're building a sales team or some other type of team, like, you need to go there and spend time and meet just tons of different people to understand, like really understand both customers, the types of people you need to hire, the types of differences in the market. So I would just say spend time. That's the most important thing.
Yeah, thank you so much. And I guess taking a sort of broader lens, we've been through some real ups and downs in the startup world over the last 5 years. And I guess the market really does seem to be picking back up again. And there's definitely lots to be optimistic about. So I'd love to hear your own predictions for the next sort of decade ahead. What are you most excited by, and what are Antler most excited by as well?
I think that predicting the next 5 to 10 years has always been tricky. And I think it's especially tricky right now because we're kind of in a place where we've seen the early days of AI and we see that it's moving really fast. What we haven't seen yet is, which I think at some point in the next 5 to 10 years we'll see, is almost like what Facebook and Uber is for mobile, what Google was for the internet, is kind of what are the new ways of doing things that will be enabled by AI that was just not a way that we did things before. And I think I'm 100% sure that there will be, let's call it 3 to 5 of these things that in 10 years looking back will be, or even might be 15 years looking back will be obvious. And we don't know what they are today. We've seen people try with, having an AI, connected to your chest, trying to record your entire life. Doesn't seem like that's working fully yet. So there's probably going to be a couple of these new business models or new ways to interact with technology that will kind of emerge over the next 5 to 10 years. And the interesting thing is we don't know what it is today. We might know. I think someone is working on it right now, and probably not even they know that they're that they're gonna be the ones to crack it. So the really exciting thing is like now probably more than ever is the time where investing in and helping founders who are in a super experimental phase is kind of the right thing to do. I think we're very excited that the winners coming out of the next 5 to 10 years will probably look very different from the winners in the last 10 years. Like the winning company in the last 10 years is like build a B2B SaaS company for a certain industry. And as long as you hit these metrics, you'll be fundable. And then in 2021, you can probably go public. Whereas I think there's not going to be a recipe for how do you build a company in the next 5 years, because that recipe will only be obvious in, let's say, 10 years or 15 years out. So now kind of backing people over anything else is more relevant today than probably it's been maybe since the kind of internet boom in the late 1990s.
Yeah. No, it's definitely going to be a very exciting time to launch a business, to be investing in them, and working so closely with these brilliant founders that are emerging in Europe and beyond. So thank you for sharing. We're sadly at an end, Vegard. We've got a couple of wrap up questions for you, but I've really enjoyed hearing all about your career. And I have to ask you, this is 40-minute mentor. So if you could be mentored by anyone, dead or alive, who would it be and why?
I'd probably pick Don Valentine. He founded Sequoia Capital, and I think what's really impressive with what he's built is not only is Sequoia kind of just stayed the premier brand among among VCs for now more than 40 years, but he built the firm in such a way that it endures way after he was involved, and now also after his death, and it's kind of gone through several transitions of leadership and is still just a real powerhouse. And I think that's really impressive. And I'd love to kind of learn the intricacies of like how did he actually build that company? How did he get the right people? How did he set up kind of the mechanisms that allows it to now survive and just be stronger as it grows?
That's a great answer, and would be a fantastic mentor for sure. Finally, Vegard, what is one piece of career advice, or it can be life advice, that you would like to leave our listeners with today?
I'd probably say always pick the next thing you're doing, not based on what that thing is, but based on who you might be doing it with. Like I think the people you work with and the people you surround yourself with is way more important than what you're actually doing in almost every single case. So I'd say always pick people over kind of industries or companies or stuff.
It's a really good piece of advice. Thank you so much for joining us. Wishing you all the very best for the year ahead. It sounds like there's lots of exciting things in store for you and Antler. And yeah, we really appreciate you sharing your mentorship with us today.
Thanks, James. Appreciate it.
Thanks so much. Thank you so much for tuning into today's episode. I really hope that you found it useful and inspiring. If we have left any questions unanswered, or if you have any feedback or guest recommendations for future series, then please make sure you get in touch on info@jbmc.co.uk. I often get asked by listeners how you can help us spread the word about 40-Minute Mentor. There are two simple ways you can help. Firstly, share this episode on your preferred social media platform, and LinkedIn is probably where I'm most likely to see it. And you can also leave us a review on either Apple Podcasts or Spotify. Every share on social media and review left on the podcast platforms really helps us to get 40-Minute Mentor in front of new audiences and share the power of mentorship even further. Thank you so much for your ongoing support, and I look forward to seeing you again next Wednesday for even more pocket-sized mentorship.